when silence became comfort. The room was too quiet for a place that once echoed with laughter. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet either, the kind that settles gently like snowfall, but the heavy silence that presses against the chest, the kind that makes every breath feel louder than it should. Sandra Bullock sat curled at the far end of a long couch, knees drawn close, arms wrapped around herself as though she were trying to keep something from slipping away. The lights were dim, not intentionally romantic or cinematic, but dim because she hadn't bothered to turn them on. Daylight filtered through tall windows, dull and gray, as if the sky itself understood that something had been lost. Her dog's bed lay untouched in the corner of the room. That was where her eyes kept drifting, again and again, no matter how much she tried to focus elsewhere. The bed was still shaped the way it always had been, slightly indented in the middle, a quiet testament to a presence that had once filled the space with warmth, movement, and unconditional love. A bowl sat nearby, cleaned but not put away. A leash hung by the door, still looped neatly on its hook, waiting for a walk that would never come. Sandra's chest tightened, and before she could stop herself, the tears came again. They weren't dramatic sobs or loud cries. They were silent, relentless tears that slipped down her face and pooled in the fabric of her sleeves. She had cried like this before on movie sets in scenes that demanded heartbreak, but this was different. There was no camera, no director calling cut, no script to tell her when the pain would end. This grief was unscripted, raw, and deeply personal. For years, her dog had been more than a companion. In the spaces between film premieres and long flights between applause and loneliness, that dog had been her constant. No expectations. No judgment, just presence, just love. When the world felt loud and demanding, her dog had been quiet reassurance. When success felt strangely empty, that small, loyal life had filled the silence with meaning. And now the silence had returned, but without the comfort. The door to the room opened softly. Sandra didn't look up. She didn't need to. She already knew who it was. There was something unmistakable about the way Keanu Reeves moved through a space, unhurried, gentle, as if he were always careful not to disturb whatever emotional balance existed in the room. He didn't announce himself. He never did. He simply arrived. He paused for a moment just inside the doorway, taking in the scene without staring, without intruding. He noticed the untouched dog bed, the leash by the door. The way Sandra's shoulders trembled, even though she made no sound. He understood instantly that this was not a moment for words. So he didn't speak. He crossed the room slowly and sat down on the couch. Not too close, not too far, leaving her space while also making sure she wasn't alone. His presence was steady, grounded, like an anchor dropped quietly beside a drifting boat. He rested his hands on his knees, eyes lowered, breathing calm and even. Minutes passed, maybe more. Time had a strange way of stretching in moments like these. Sandra wiped her face with the back of her hand, frustrated with herself. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her voice cracking. "I didn't mean to," she stopped, swallowing hard. "I thought I was okay, I really did." Keanu didn't rush to respond. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and gentle, carrying no urgency. "You don't have to be okay," he said. "Not here." That was all. Something about those words broke the fragile wall she had been holding together. Sandra turned slightly toward him, her face crumpling as fresh tears spilled over. "He was just always there," she whispered. "No matter what kind of day I had, no matter how exhausted or overwhelmed I felt, he didn't care about any of that." Keanu nodded slowly, understanding etched into the lines of his face. "That's what makes it hurt so much," he said. "They love us without conditions. When they're gone, it feels like the world takes something pure with them." Sandra pressed her lips together, trying to steady herself. "People keep telling me I should be grateful for the time I had, and I am. I really am, but it doesn't make this part easier." "No," Keanu agreed quietly. "Gratitude doesn't cancel grief. They can exist at the same time." She looked at him then, really looked at him, as if surprised by how precisely he had put into words what she'd been feeling but couldn't articulate. For a moment, neither of them spoke again. The room returned to silence, but it was different now, less oppressive, softer. Keanu shifted slightly and reached down to the floor, picking up a framed photograph that had been leaning against the coffee table. It was a simple picture. Sandra sitting on the grass in a park, her dog sprawled across her lap, tongue out, eyes bright. She was laughing in the photo, head thrown back, completely unguarded. "He looks happy," Keanu said, holding the frame carefully as though it were something fragile. "He was," Sandra replied. "He really was." And so were you, Keanu added, glancing at her. Right there in that moment. She nodded slowly. He gave me that, she said. Those moments when everything else felt complicated. Keanu placed the photo back where he found it, making sure it stood upright. Then that happiness doesn't disappear, he said. It doesn't end just because his life did. It becomes part of you, part of how you show up for the world. Sandra let out a shaky breath. It doesn't feel like that right now. I know, he said, but it will, not today, not tomorrow, but one day. She leaned back against the couch, exhausted by the effort of holding herself together. I didn't expect it to hurt like this, she admitted. I've lost people before, I've handled grief, but this feels different. Keanu's gaze softened. Because with him you didn't have to perform, you didn't have to be strong or successful or composed. You were just you. The words settled into the room, heavy with truth. Sandra closed her eyes, letting them land exactly where they needed to. For the first time since she'd gotten the news, she allowed herself to stop fighting the tears. She cried openly now, shoulders shaking, grief finally given permission to exist without apology. Keanu didn't move away, he didn't interrupt, he simply stayed. After a while, Sandra's breathing slowed. The storm inside her began to quiet, not because the pain was gone, but because it had been witnessed. Because someone had sat beside her and allowed the silence to hold meaning rather than emptiness. She opened her eyes and spoke softly, almost to herself. Thank you for not trying to fix it. Keanu met her gaze. Some things aren't meant to be fixed, he said. They're meant to be felt. Outside, the gray sky began to shift. Not dramatically, no sudden burst of sunshine, but just enough for a thin strip of light to slide through the clouds and fall across the floor near the dog bed. It wasn't a sign or a miracle, just a quiet moment of change. And for the first time since her loss, Sandra felt something other than pure sorrow. She felt understood. The weight of unseen grief. The hours passed without either of them noticing, the kind of slow, indistinct time that settles in when emotions take control and clocks become meaningless. The light outside shifted gradually, afternoon sliding toward evening, and the room that had earlier felt suffocating now carried a quieter heaviness, as though grief itself had finally exhaled. Sandra remained seated on the couch, her body tired in a way sleep could not fix, while Keanu stayed beside her, not as a guest waiting for the right moment to leave, but as someone who understood that presence, not duration, was what mattered most in moments like this. She stared ahead, her eyes occasionally drifting toward familiar corners of the room, each one holding a memory she hadn't realized was so deeply embedded until it was suddenly all she could see. After a long silence, Sandra spoke again, her voice steadier but still fragile, as though she were testing each word before allowing it into the air. She said that what surprised her most was not the sadness itself, but how quietly it had arrived, slipping into her life without warning, settling into ordinary moments like mornings when she reached for the leash out of habit or evenings when she expected the soft sound of paws following her from room to room. She admitted that she felt foolish sometimes, questioning whether her grief was too much, whether people would understand why losing a dog could feel like losing a piece of herself. And she confessed that part of her pain came from the fear that the world expected her to move on faster simply because the loss wasn't one it knew how to categorize. Keanu listened without interruption, his attention fully on her, not offering solutions or comparisons, but allowing her words to exist exactly as they were. When he finally responded, his voice carried a depth shaped by years of quiet understanding rather than dramatic insight, and he told her that grief often hurts the most when it goes unseen, when it doesn't fit into the narratives people are comfortable acknowledging. He explained that the love we give freely, without conditions or expectations, leaves the deepest imprint, and when that love is gone, the absence feels larger because it was never diluted by complexity or obligation. He reminded her that pain doesn't need permission to be valid, and that the size of loss is measured not by how others perceive it, but by how deeply it shaped our daily lives. Sandra absorbed his words slowly, letting them settle into her thoughts, and for the first time since her loss, she felt less ashamed of how deeply it affected her. She admitted that her dog had seen her in moments no one else ever had, in times when success felt hollow, and when the world's expectations felt unbearably loud, and she described how comforting it had been to come home to a presence that asked nothing of her except honesty. As she spoke, memories surfaced more clearly now, not just of the last days filled with worry and fear, but of simpler moments, Quiet mornings, long walks, lazy afternoons where time seemed to stretch endlessly, and happiness required no explanation. Keanu shared that he understood this kind of loss more than most people realized, not by recounting details or drawing attention to his own experiences, but by acknowledging the universal truth that love, when given without reservation, leaves behind a silence that can feel overwhelming. He spoke about how grief often becomes heavier when we try to carry it alone, when we convince ourselves that strength means silence, and he gently challenged the idea that resilience requires hiding pain rather than allowing it to exist openly. He told her that the world often confuses endurance with healing, pushing people to move forward before they've had the chance to truly process what they've lost. The conversation drifted naturally, unforced, moving between memories and reflections, between moments of quiet and moments where emotion crept back into Sandra's voice. She found herself speaking about things she hadn't planned to say, about fears she rarely acknowledged, about how exhausting it could be to always appear composed and capable while carrying so much unseen weight. The room felt different now, less like a place marked by loss and more like a space where honesty was allowed to breathe. And she realized that this was what she had needed most, not reassurance that things would be okay, but permission to feel broken without judgment. As evening settled fully outside, the light fading into softer tones, Sandra noticed that the silence between them no longer felt empty. It was filled with understanding, with shared acknowledgement that some forms of pain don't need to be spoken aloud to be recognized. She felt something shift inside her, not relief exactly, but a subtle easing, as though the tight knot in her chest had loosened just enough to let air in. For the first time since her loss, she allowed herself to imagine that healing did not mean forgetting, that moving forward did not require leaving love behind, and that grief, painful as it was, could coexist with gratitude rather than cancel it out. Keanu eventually stood and suggested, gently and without pressure, that they step outside for a moment, not to escape the memories inside the house, but to remind her that the world was still capable of holding quiet beauty alongside sorrow. Sandra hesitated before agreeing, her heart heavy with reluctance, but she trusted his calm certainty and followed him to the door. As she picked up her coat, her eyes fell once more on the leash hanging by the wall, and instead of turning away, she paused, touching it lightly, allowing herself to acknowledge the pain rather than avoid it. When they stepped outside, the evening air was cool and still, the sky painted in muted colors that felt strangely comforting rather than sad. Sandra took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the day settle differently now, and as she stood beside Keanu in the fading light, she realized that while her grief was far from over, she was no longer carrying it alone. There was a quiet strength in that realization, a subtle reminder that even in moments of profound loss, connection could offer a form of healing that words alone could not provide. Learning to breathe through the pain. The quiet of the evening settled around them as they stood outside, the cool air brushing against Sandra's skin in a way that felt grounding rather than uncomfortable. And for the first time in days, she noticed her own breathing without feeling overwhelmed by it. The world beyond the walls of her home moved at its own gentle pace, unaware of the private grief unfolding within her, and that realization brought a strange sense of comfort, as though life itself was patiently waiting for her to catch up rather than demanding that she hurry forward. Keanu remained beside her, hands tucked into his coat pockets, his posture relaxed but attentive, and she became acutely aware of how rare it was to share silence with someone who didn't feel the need to fill it with distraction or advice. After a while, Sandra spoke, her voice thoughtful, carrying less rawness than before but still shaped by vulnerability, and she admitted that grief had made her question parts of herself she thought were unshakable. She said that losing her dog had stripped away a sense of emotional safety she hadn't realized depended so heavily on that companionship, and she confessed that without it, even familiar successes felt distant, as though they belonged to a different version of her life. She talked about how exhausting it could be to appear resilient in a world that celebrates strength, but rarely makes space for quiet sadness, and she wondered aloud whether she had been relying too much on distractions to avoid fully facing what she was feeling. Keanu listened carefully, then responded in a way that didn't minimize her pain or romanticize it, explaining that grief often forces us to confront the parts of ourselves we keep carefully hidden during busy, successful lives. He told her that pain has a way of slowing everything down, not as punishment, but as an invitation to notice what truly matters when the noise fades. He shared that learning to sit with discomfort rather than immediately escaping it had been one of the hardest lessons of his own life, and that while avoidance can feel protective in the short term, it often deepens the wound over time by denying us the chance to process and heal. Sandra considered his words as they walked slowly down the quiet street, their footsteps unhurried, and she realized that she had been measuring her recovery by how quickly she could return to her usual routines rather than by how honestly she was allowing herself to grieve. She admitted that she feared becoming stuck in sadness, mistaking emotional openness for weakness, and she expressed concern that if she allowed herself to feel too deeply, she might lose the drive and focus that had carried her through so many demanding chapters of her life. The thought of vulnerability, she said, felt risky in a world that often rewards composure over authenticity. Keanu gently challenged that belief, reminding her that true resilience is not the absence of pain, but the willingness to move forward while carrying it with honesty and compassion. He explained that strength does not diminish when we acknowledge loss. Instead, it evolves, becoming quieter, deeper, and more sustainable. He spoke about how the people who had impacted his life the most were not those who appeared invincible, but those who allowed themselves to be human, flawed, and open even when it was uncomfortable. His words were not delivered as lessons, but as reflections shaped by lived experience, and Sandra felt them resonate in a way that felt personal rather than abstract. As they continued walking, Sandra found herself recalling small moments she had shared with her dog that had nothing to do with joy or sadness, but simply with presence, moments where sitting together in silence had been enough. She realized then that what she missed most was not just the companionship, but the way that presence had allowed her to feel grounded without explanation or effort. That realization brought a subtle shift in her understanding of grief, helping her see it not only as a response to loss, but as evidence of the depth of love she had been fortunate enough to experience. When they eventually returned to the house, the familiar space felt different, less heavy than before, as though the walls had absorbed some of the unspoken tension and released it back into the night air. Sandra noticed that her body felt calmer, her thoughts less frantic, and although the pain remained, it no longer felt suffocating. She thanked Keanu quietly for staying, not just physically but emotionally, and she acknowledged that his willingness to sit with her discomfort had given her permission to do the same for herself. Later, as she prepared for bed, Sandra paused once more near the dog bed, this time not with avoidance or despair but with a softer awareness. She knelt beside it, running her hand gently over the fabric, allowing herself to remember without collapsing under the weight of the memory. In that moment, she understood that healing would not come from erasing pain, but from learning how to breathe through it, how to carry love forward without being consumed by loss. As she turned off the lights and settled into the quiet of the night, Sandra felt a fragile but real sense of steadiness return, not because everything had been resolved, but because she had taken the first true step toward acceptance. The silence no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like space, a place where grief, gratitude, and resilience could coexist, slowly teaching her how to move forward without leaving what mattered behind. When pain begins to change shape. The days that followed carried a different rhythm, quieter but steadier, as though something inside Sandra had subtly shifted without her fully realizing when it happened. Grief no longer arrived in overwhelming waves that knocked the breath from her lungs. Instead, it settled into her mornings and evenings like a familiar weight she was learning to carry rather than fight. She noticed it in small moments, in the pause before opening the door, in the instinct to listen for sounds that were no longer there, and in the way her heart still tightened when she saw other people walking their dogs in the early hours of the day. Yet alongside the pain, something else had begun to take shape, a sense of awareness that grief, while deeply personal, did not have to remain isolating. Keanu remained present during this time, not constantly or intrusively, but with a quiet consistency that reassured her without demanding emotional energy she did not always have. Their conversations became less about loss itself and more about what loss reveals, about the ways pain can strip away distractions and force clarity where there was once noise. Sandra found herself reflecting on how much of her life had been spent moving quickly, transitioning from one responsibility to the next without allowing space for stillness, and she recognized that her dog had been the one constant reminder to slow down, to exist fully in the present moment without expectations or agendas. Without that grounding presence, She was beginning to understand just how much she had relied on external motion to avoid internal reflection. One afternoon, as they sat together in the living room with sunlight filtering through the windows, Sandra spoke openly about a growing realization that unsettled her. She admitted that while grief had initially felt like something to survive, it was now asking something of her, inviting her to confront deeper questions about how she wanted to live moving forward. She spoke about the fear that came with this awareness, the uncertainty of redefining purpose in the absence of something that had quietly shaped her emotional world for so long. And she acknowledged that part of her wanted to retreat into familiar routines simply to avoid the discomfort of change. Keanu listened carefully, then shared his perspective with the same calm honesty that had grounded her from the beginning, explaining that pain often becomes transformative only when we stop trying to outrun it. He told her that grief does not demand immediate answers, only presence, and that purpose often reveals itself slowly, through small acts of intention rather than dramatic decisions. He spoke about how honoring loss does not mean clinging to sorrow, but allowing it to inform how we show up for others, how we choose compassion over indifference, and how we recognize suffering in places we once overlooked. Sandra absorbed his words thoughtfully, recognizing a quiet truth in them that resonated deeply. She began to notice how her own pain had softened her perspective, making her more attuned to subtle emotional shifts in others, more patient, more willing to listen without interruption. She realized that grief had stripped away some of the emotional armor she had unconsciously built over the years, leaving her more open, more vulnerable, but also more genuine. This awareness frightened her at times, yet it also felt strangely liberating, as though she were reconnecting with a version of herself she had lost long before her dog had passed. As the weeks progressed, Sandra found herself drawn to small gestures that felt meaningful rather than performative, moments of quiet kindness that required no recognition or explanation. She volunteered her time discreetly, offered support where it was needed without drawing attention to herself, and allowed herself to sit with others in their moments of discomfort without rushing to fix or resolve them. In doing so, she began to understand that grief had expanded her capacity for empathy, deepening her connection to the world rather than shrinking it. Keanu observed this transformation without commentary, respecting the personal nature of her journey, and his continued presence served as a reminder that healing does not need to be rushed or displayed. Sandra appreciated that he never framed her progress as something she owed to anyone else, allowing her to move at her own pace without expectations. She realized that what had helped her most was not advice or reassurance, but the simple experience of being seen and supported during a moment when she felt most fragile. One evening, as Sandra stood once more near the dog bed, she felt something unexpected emerge alongside the familiar ache, a sense of gratitude that no longer felt painful to acknowledge. She understood then that love does not end with loss. It transforms, shaping who we become in ways that continue to ripple outward long after the original bond has ended. The pain she carried was not a sign of weakness, but evidence of a life touched deeply by connection, and that realization brought with it a quiet sense of purpose she had not anticipated. As she turned away from the corner of the room and joined Keanu in the soft glow of the living space, Sandra felt more grounded than she had since the beginning of her loss. The grief remained, but it no longer defined her entire emotional landscape. Instead, it had become part of a larger, evolving understanding of resilience, one rooted not in denial or speed, but in presence, compassion, and the courage to allow pain to reshape the heart rather than harden it. Turning love into something that lasts. By the time another season began to edge its way into the city, Sandra noticed that her grief no longer announced itself with the same sharp urgency it once had, though it never fully disappeared. Instead, it lived quietly alongside her, present but no longer overwhelming, reminding her not of what she had lost, but of what she had been given. She began to understand that healing was not a destination she would one day arrive at fully intact, but a relationship she would continue to navigate with patience and honesty. This realization softened something inside her, allowing her to move through her days with greater intention rather than quiet resistance. What surprised her most was how naturally her loss had begun to shape her choices, not through dramatic resolutions, but through small, deliberate shifts in how she spent her time and attention. She found herself drawn to spaces where presence mattered more than performance, where listening carried more weight than speaking, and where compassion could exist without explanation. The pain she had once tried to escape now guided her gently, helping her recognize moments where her empathy could offer comfort to others who were carrying their own silent burdens. Keanu noticed these changes without naming them, respecting the private nature of her evolution, and his continued steadiness served as a mirror rather than a guide. During one quiet afternoon, as they shared coffee in a sunlit room, Sandra spoke openly about a growing desire she hadn't yet fully articulated, a feeling that honoring her dog's memory meant more than remembrance alone. She explained that she wanted to transform her grief into something constructive, something that extended the unconditional love she had received into the world in a way that felt authentic rather than symbolic. Keanu listened carefully, then encouraged her not by suggesting what she should do, but by reminding her that purpose often reveals itself through action rather than planning. He told her that when love has nowhere to go, it becomes pain, but when given direction, it can become a source of quiet strength that benefits far more than the person who carries it. His words resonated deeply, helping her trust that she didn't need to have every step defined in advance, only the willingness to begin. In the weeks that followed, Sandra took those first steps quietly, without announcements or expectations. She became involved with causes that aligned naturally with her values, offering her time and resources in ways that felt meaningful rather than obligatory. She discovered that being present for others, particularly those who felt unseen or unheard, brought a sense of fulfillment that did not erase her grief but placed it within a larger context. Through these experiences, she began to understand that loss, while painful, had expanded her capacity to connect rather than diminish it. There were moments when the sadness returned unexpectedly, catching her off guard in familiar places or during seemingly ordinary conversations, but she no longer viewed these moments as setbacks. Instead, she allowed them to pass through her without judgment, understanding that grief's persistence did not indicate failure, but rather the enduring nature of love. Keanu's quiet support remained constant throughout this period, offering reassurance not through words, but through his unwavering respect for her process. One evening, as Sandra reflected on how far she had come, she realized that the silence she once feared had become something she now welcomed. It was no longer empty or accusatory, but reflective, offering space for thought, memory, and intention. She recognized that her dog's presence had taught her how to love without reservation, and his absence had taught her how to carry that love forward rather than allowing it to remain trapped in sorrow. Standing once more in her living room, Sandra felt a profound sense of calm settle over her, not because the pain was gone, but because it had been integrated into who she was becoming. She understood now that honoring loss did not mean holding on to grief indefinitely, but allowing love to evolve into something that could continue to serve others. That understanding brought with it a quiet confidence, a sense that even in moments of vulnerability, she possessed a strength rooted in compassion rather than endurance alone. As she joined Keanu later that night, sharing a comfortable silence that no longer required explanation, Sandra felt certain of one thing above all else. The love she had lost had not ended, it had simply changed form. And in learning to give it new direction, she had discovered a resilience that felt deeper, steadier, and more enduring than anything she had known before. When silence becomes strength, time continued its steady movement forward, not erasing what Sandra had lost but reshaping how it lived within her, and she began to understand that healing was less about closure and more about continuity. The pain no longer dominated her days, yet it had not vanished either. Instead, it had become woven into her awareness in a way that felt quieter, more stable, like a deep current beneath calm water. She noticed that the memories which once brought only tears now carried warmth as well, reminding her not just of absence, but of the privilege of having loved so fully and without reservation. That realization settled gently into her heart, bringing with it a sense of peace she had once believed impossible. Keanu remained part of this final stretch of her journey, not as someone guiding her forward, but as a steady witness to the person she had become through her experience. Their conversations grew simpler, less focused on loss and more on the present moment, on shared reflections about life, purpose, and the quiet ways people influence one another without realizing it. Sandra recognized that his greatest gift during her grief had not been wisdom or reassurance, but the rare ability to sit beside pain without attempting to control it, teaching her through example that compassion does not require solutions, only sincerity. One evening, as they sat together watching the city lights flicker on in the distance, Sandra spoke with a calm certainty she hadn't felt in months, acknowledging that her loss had permanently changed her, but not in the way she once feared. She explained that grief had softened her edges, slowed her pace, and deepened her understanding of others, allowing her to meet the world with greater patience and humility. She no longer felt the need to shield herself from sadness, understanding now that emotional openness was not a liability, but a strength that allowed genuine connection to flourish. Keanu listened quietly, then shared that witnessing her journey had reaffirmed something he had long believed, that the measure of resilience is not how quickly we recover, but how honestly we allow experiences to shape us. He told her that the most meaningful transformations rarely happen in moments of public triumph, but in private struggles where no applause exists, only choice. His words did not feel like praise but recognition, and Sandra felt seen not for what she had endured, but for how she had grown. As the night deepened, Sandra reflected on the silence that had once terrified her, realizing that it no longer felt empty or accusatory. Instead, it had become a place of reflection, a space where she could listen to herself without distraction or fear. She understood that silence, when met with acceptance rather than resistance, could become a source of clarity rather than loneliness. The absence she once associated solely with loss had transformed into room for intention, compassion, and renewed purpose. In the days that followed, Sandra carried this understanding with her into every aspect of her life, approaching each interaction with a quiet mindfulness shaped by her experience. She found that she was more present, more willing to listen, and more attuned to the subtle struggles others carried beneath composed exteriors. The grief that had once felt isolating had ultimately expanded her sense of connection, reminding her that pain, when acknowledged rather than hidden, has the power to unite rather than divide. Standing alone one morning in the soft light of a new day, Sandra paused in her living room, no longer avoiding the corner where memories once overwhelmed her. She felt gratitude settle gently alongside sadness, understanding that love does not disappear with loss, but continues to influence who we become and how we treat others. The lessons she had learned through her grief were not ones she would ever forget, and she accepted that they would continue to guide her long after the pain had softened further with time. As she stepped forward into her day, Sandra carried with her a quiet confidence rooted not in certainty, but in compassion. She knew now that resilience was not about moving on, but about moving forward with honesty, empathy, and an open heart. And in that understanding, she discovered that even the deepest silence could become a source of strength, reminding her that the human spirit, when shaped by love and loss alike, is capable of extraordinary grace.